Hey there, welcome back. I think it's safe to say that we're all here because we're fascinated by how we learn, how we figure stuff out, and especially how some of the greatest minds throughout history have grappled with these questions of knowledge.
Absolutely, always trying to make sense of the world around us, right?
Right. And today we're going to do a deep dive into the work of Giacomo Zabarella.
Oh, a key figure in Renaissance Italian Aristotelianism.
Exactly. You can think of him as like this intellectual architect, someone who really tried to build a framework for understanding how we gain and how we organize knowledge. And the sources we've got here, they really offer this incredible comprehensive look at his life, his work, and how he fit into the whole history of philosophy and science.
Yeah, it's really quite impressive, the breadth of his work. But we'll be focusing primarily on his ideas about logic, methodology, and natural philosophy, the cornerstones of his thought.
So, our mission, if you will, is to really try and get to the heart of Zabarella's ideas, see why they were so important back then, and maybe even uncover some insights that might resonate with us even today, centuries later. What do you think?
Sounds like a plan. Let's dive in.
Okay, so first things first. Giacomo Zabarella, born in 1533 in Padua, a city absolutely buzzing with intellectual activity. Now, he wasn't just some ordinary scholar. He came from a noble family, received a really broad humanist education.
A real Renaissance man.
Absolutely. Imagine like a young prince exposed to all sorts of knowledge, from the classics, of course, to logic, to the intricacies of the natural world, even delving into abstract metaphysics and the precision of mathematics.
All of these things really came together to shape his comprehensive approach to understanding knowledge itself. And it's fascinating, too, because he spent his whole academic career at the University of Padua, his intellectual home, you could say.
Oh, really? So he rose through the ranks there.
Yeah, ultimately becoming a highly respected professor of natural philosophy. And what's interesting is, unlike a lot of people who were studying nature at the time, he didn't actually come from a medical background.
Huh. Okay. I'm guessing that's going to come up later when we talk about his ideas on natural philosophy and medicine, right?
You got it. Now, this was a guy dedicated to his work. Even when the plague hit the region, forcing him out of the city, he didn't stop. He used that time to actually put together his collected logical works, the Opera Logica. Talk about commitment, huh?
Wow, in the middle of a plague. That's incredible.
Right. And that was really just the beginning of his extensive writing on logic and natural philosophy. He was really driven by this need to create a coherent, systematic understanding of Aristotle's work.
He wasn't just repeating old ideas, was he?
No, not at all. He critically analyzed the ancient Greek commentators, people like Alexander of Aphrodisias, and then the big medieval thinkers Aquinas and Averroes, just to name a few. And really crucially, he insisted on going back to those original Greek texts himself.
So he wasn't just relying on translations.
That's right. He was really after philosophical precision, even if it meant moving away from that elegant style that some humanists were so fond of.
Okay, so now, a really fundamental idea for Zabarella was this distinction he made between what he called arts and sciences. This wasn't just some random classification. It really shaped his whole view of knowledge.
Absolutely. He was following Aristotle here, establishing a really clear division. For Zabarella, sciences dealt with the natural world, with things that are necessary, things that are eternal.
So the unchanging laws of nature, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. They're contemplative disciplines, focused on understanding these fundamental truths of existence. Arts, on the other hand, they belong more to the human realm. They're concerned with things that are contingent, things that can be created or changed.
So more practical skills.
Exactly, they're productive, focused on creating something new rather than just understanding what's already there. So think about, for instance, astronomy, trying to understand the movements of the stars versus, say, the art of shipbuilding, which creates something entirely new.
And to be a true science for Zabarella, it needed more than just observation, right? There had to be a certain kind of certainty.
Precisely. He argued that for something to qualify as a true science, it needed two types of certainty. First, what he called ontological certainty, meaning that the objects of study themselves had to be necessary, incapable of being otherwise.
So their existence is just like a given.
Exactly. And then second, cognitive certainty. The scientist themselves has to have absolute conviction in the truth of their understanding. It's a pretty high bar for knowledge, you could say.
That's a very high standard indeed. So this idea of certainty then fed into his concept of a hierarchy of disciplines.
Right. It wasn't just a flat landscape where every type of knowledge was equal. He envisioned this structured hierarchy where all the practical endeavors, what he called active philosophy, ultimately aimed towards this higher pursuit of contemplation.
So even our everyday skills should ideally lead us to a higher understanding.
Exactly. He drew on both Plato and Aristotle here, believing that true human flourishing, it's not just found in action, but in intellectual contemplation. That's the path towards real human perfection. Even the schools and crafts we develop, they should ideally free us up to pursue knowledge for its own sake.
So it's like the tools we use to improve the world are ultimately in service of the mind.
That's a great way to put it. And, when it came to actually defining what they were studying, the approach differed between the arts and the sciences.
Oh, how so?
Well, in the productive arts, the definition was mainly about the end product, the thing you were creating. So reaching perfect theoretical knowledge wasn't really the main goal.
But in the sciences, it was all about really clearly defining what you were studying.
Right, because the goal there was perfect knowledge and understanding of what truly exists in its unchanging nature. Science explores what is already there. Art is about bringing something new into being through human skill and effort.
So for Zabarella, what were the core contemplative sciences, the real pillars of knowledge?
He followed Aristotle's framework, identifying three primary contemplative sciences. First, divine science, what we now call metaphysics. Second, mathematics. And finally, natural philosophy. And he really stressed that each one of these was independent, each with its own unique subject of study, what he called the res considerata, literally the thing being considered, and its own way of considering it, the modus considerandi.
Okay, so different lenses for understanding different aspects of reality.
Precisely. So natural philosophy, for example, it focuses on physical beings that have this inherent capacity for change and movement. That's quite different from metaphysics, which explores the fundamental nature of being itself. And it's different from mathematics, which deals with these abstract entities and their relationships.
I see. So each science has its own distinct domain and its own set of tools for investigation.
Exactly. And, this emphasis on the independent nature of natural philosophy, it was a really important point in the intellectual debates happening at the time.
Oh, I bet. There was so much going on during the Renaissance. Now, you mentioned these middle sciences like astronomy and optics. How did they fit into this structure, especially since they seem to rely heavily on mathematics?
That's a great question. While some people back then might have thought they were less certain because of how much they relied on math, Zabarella actually argued that they could still achieve a pretty high level of certainty. His reasoning was that even though they used mathematical tools and concepts, their ultimate goal was still understanding the physical world.
So even though they use math, they're ultimately grounded in observations of the natural world.
Yes, like in astronomy, it's the movements of celestial bodies, or in optics, the nature of light. However, it's important to note that Zabarella's own approach to natural philosophy, it was really deeply rooted in explaining things through causes and qualities.
Rather than primarily for mathematics.
Yeah, he didn't fully embrace the potential of mathematics as the primary key to unlocking the secrets of nature, not in the way that became more prominent later on.
Okay, interesting. So moving on to logic, Zabarella actually didn't consider it a science in itself, did he?
That's right.
That seems a bit counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Maybe at first, but he was following this long tradition going back to Aristotle's Organon. He saw logic not as a body of knowledge, but more as an instrument, a tool, or to use his word, instrumentum, a tool that can be applied across all the arts and sciences.
Okay, so it's more like a set of methods.
Yes, like it doesn't have its own specific subject matter, unlike, say, physics or biology. Instead, it deals with the concepts and methods we use to reason about things in the world.
So it helps us think clearly, no matter what we're thinking about.
Exactly. He made this analogy with grammar. Grammar is all about expressing our thoughts correctly in language. Logic is about making sure our concepts are ordered and coherent. He used this term, notionum secundae, literally second intentions, to describe these concepts.
Interesting. And I guess the role of logic is to help us tell good reasoning from bad reasoning, no matter what field we're in.
Exactly, that was its fundamental role. And following Averroes, he further divided logic into universal logic, dealing with principles that apply to every subject, like the categories of being, and particular logic, which is more specialized. He even included things like rhetoric and poetics within logic.
Wait, rhetoric and poetics.
Yeah, because they use argumentation too, things
Yeah.
like syllogisms and examples, even though it's for different purposes than, strict scientific demonstration.
I guess you could say that any persuasive argument uses logic in some way.
Right. And then the very nature of logic itself could change depending on how it was being used and for what purpose.
Oh, that's interesting. So how did that work?
Well, because logic is a tool, its character is shaped by what it's applied to and what it's trying to achieve. So, for example, rhetoric and poetics, they're concerned with the good of the state, and they use logic for persuasion and artistic expression, not necessarily just for getting knowledge.
Okay, so different goals for using logic.
Exactly. And then, unfortunately, there's sophistical logic, which is just aimed at deception. Then there's dialectic, dealing with probable opinions, reasoning from premises that are generally accepted. And finally, there's demonstrative logic, which is strictly focused on establishing necessary truths based on first principles.
Okay, so a whole spectrum of ways to use logic, from like sneaky tricks to rigorous scientific proof. Now, this distinction Zabarella makes between ordo, the order of presentation, and methodus, the method of discovery, that seems really important to his whole approach.
It is. He thought it was vital to separate how we organize and present knowledge we've already got from the actual process of discovering new knowledge.
So, like, the difference between teaching something and actually figuring it out yourself?
Exactly. He used ordo to refer to that systematic arrangement of a discipline, for teaching and learning. And he saw two main types: compositive order, going from general principles to specific instances, which he thought was best for the contemplative sciences.
Because you're trying to build a complete picture,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And then there's the resolutive order, which starts with the end result and works back to the fundamental principles. He thought that was more suited to moral philosophy and the practical arts, where the goal is action.
Okay, so different ways of organizing knowledge depending on what you're trying to do with it. And then the methodus, the actual method of discovery, that was also divided into different types.
Right, for him, genuine methods of discovery, they were intellectual tools that let us move from what we know to what we don't know. And they had to have a certain argumentative force. He identified only two real methods: the demonstrative or compositive method, which goes from cause to effect.
Like in mathematics.
Exactly. And then the resolutive method, going the other way, from effect back to its cause. And he connected induction with this second method, seeing it as a way to uncover those fundamental principles that aren't immediately obvious.
Interesting. So it's like you're working backward to find the underlying reasons for things.
That's the idea.
Mm.
And this resolutive method, when it's combined with the compositive method, forms the basis of his really influential regressus method.
Which we'll get to in a minute. Right.
Right. But first, it's interesting to note that this distinction between ordo and methodus actually led to a bit of a debate with another scholar, Piccolomini.
Oh, right. I remember reading about that.
Yeah, they had this big discussion about the best order for teaching, especially in fields like ethics and other practical disciplines.
Fields that are about guiding human action.
Exactly. Zabarella thought the order of presentation should ideally mirror the method of discovery. So, starting from general principles in the sciences or from the end goal in the arts. But Piccolomini, he argued that teaching has its own logic, and sometimes it's better to start with simple concepts and gradually work towards the more complex principles.
So like a more pedagogical approach.
Exactly. And this difference of opinion actually highlighted a deeper one about the purpose of philosophy.
Oh, how so?
Well, Zabarella, he really emphasized that contemplative nature, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. But Piccolomini, he saw philosophy as also having a crucial role in shaping civic life and guiding behavior.
Okay, so two different visions of what philosophy is really for. Now, let's dive into this regressus method. It sounds like a pretty central part of Zabarella's approach, especially for understanding the natural world.
It is. It's essentially this elegant two-step process that combines those resolutive and compositive approaches we were talking about.
So it's a back and forth between effects and causes.
Right. So you start with a known effect, something you can observe in the world. And through resolution, which he also called demonstratio quia, a demonstration of the fact, you reason backward to figure out what caused it.
So you see something happening and you ask why.
Exactly. And that first step might involve inductive reasoning, careful observation, different ways of moving from what you see to a possible explanation. Then, in the second step, you reverse it. You start with the cause you've just established, and you go through composition, which he called demonstratio propter quid, demonstration of the reasoned fact, to explain why that effect happens the way it does.
Okay, but how do you avoid just going in circles here? If you're going from effect to cause and then back to effect, it seems like you could just keep repeating yourself.
That's the challenge, and Zabarella was very aware of it. To deal with this potential circularity, he introduced a third step: mental examination, examen mental. This is where his understanding of the agent intellect comes in, that active part of the mind that helps us grasp universal concepts. He argued that this mental step lets the mind transform that initial, maybe kind of fuzzy understanding of the cause, which we got from the resolution phase, into a much clearer, distinct knowledge of it.
So it's like you have to actively think through the relationship between cause and effect to really make sure you're not just making assumptions.
Exactly. This mental processing, this analysis of the cause in relation to its effects, it was key to breaking out of that potential circularity and making sure the knowledge gained through the regressus was actually valid.
So it's not just about observation, it's about careful, structured thinking. Do you have any examples of how Zabarella himself applied this regressus method to actually understand things in the natural world?
Oh, definitely. He pointed to some of Aristotle's arguments for things that seem really simple, like the fact that planets appear to be relatively close to us, or the idea that the moon is spherical. He thought the regressus method could really clarify these arguments.
So even those basic observations have a deeper logic behind them.
Exactly. And he also analyzed Aristotle's more complex philosophical proofs, like the argument for the existence of first matter, based on the fact that things change substantially, or the proof for an eternal first mover as the ultimate source of all motion in the universe.
So really big foundational ideas.
Exactly. And in all these cases, you see that characteristic movement from an observed effect back to a proposed cause and then forward again, demonstrating why that cause would necessarily lead to that effect.
And this whole emphasis on methodology, particularly this detailed regressus method, it wasn't just an abstract intellectual exercise, was it?
Not at all. The 16th century was a period of so much intellectual change. New ways of investigating nature were emerging. There were all these debates about the scientific rigor of these new fields, including natural philosophy itself, and even the more practical, empirically based arts and crafts. And all these discussions about Ordo and Methodist, especially Zabarella's regressus, they were really part of this effort to define and defend the legitimacy of these different areas of inquiry.
So it was about staking out a place for these new ways of knowing within the established intellectual world.
Exactly. And, a lot of those debates, they're still relevant today when we think about how different types of knowledge are valued and how we go about validating them.
Okay, so let's turn our attention now to Zabarella's thoughts on the science of the soul. Where did he place this within his overall system of knowledge?
This was a big one for him. He explored it in detail in his commentary on Aristotle's De Anima, and he really grappled with the question of where the study of the soul fit within natural philosophy.
It seems like a tricky question, like, is it about the physical world or something more?
Exactly. And, Zabarella, he carefully considered Aristotle's criteria for ranking the sciences, like the inherent nobility of their subject matter and the precision of their demonstrations.
So some topics are just more important.
That was one way of looking at it. But he also thought the precision of the methods you use, like how rigorously you apply logic, was also a key factor.
So how well you can actually study something matters too.
Precisely. And when it came to the science of the soul specifically, he made a pretty strong case for considering it the most noble and certain part of natural philosophy.
Wow, really?
Yeah, he even called it the king and emperor of natural philosophy, the foundation for understanding everything else.
What was his reasoning there?
He thought that the science of the soul deals with the fundamental causes of life and activity in all living things, in animals and plants, and that these causes were, in a sense, the most fundamental and knowable, both to us and in the very order of nature.
Okay, so understanding the soul is like understanding the very source of life itself. And it sounds like he was making a real effort to elevate the importance of natural philosophy as a whole.
Absolutely. He took something that had maybe been seen as a more metaphysical topic in the past,
Yeah.
and he firmly placed it at the very top of natural philosophy. And what's interesting is, following a tradition that went all the way back to Alexander of Aphrodisias, he deliberately left the whole question of the soul's immortality to theology.
Oh, so that was outside the bounds of natural philosophy for him.
Yeah, he suggested that Aristotle, as a natural philosopher, hadn't really addressed it directly, and there's still debate about what Zabarella himself actually believed on that point.
Okay, so a little bit of mystery there. So how did he understand the process of thinking itself, what we call intellection?
Well, he reconstructed it in a way that was kind of similar to how we experience sense perception.
Okay, so like a parallel between how we understand the world through our senses and how we understand it intellectually.
Right. He theorized that there are these things called intelligible species, kind of like mental blueprints of the forms of things. And these are produced through the interaction of the phantasma, which is like a mental image from our senses, and the active power of what he called the agent intellect.
So our senses provide the raw material and the agent intellect helps us make sense of it.
Exactly. These intelligible species then act on what he called the possible intellect, which is what leads to understanding.
And these are all parts of the mind.
Yes, he thought that for a sensory image or phantasma to be truly understood, it needs to be illuminated by the agent intellect, which reveals the universal concepts within that particular experience. He even suggested that this agent intellect, this power that makes things understandable, could possibly be identified with God as the ultimate source of all intelligibility.
Wow. So a really deep connection between the human mind and the divine. So in this process of thinking, where does human agency, free will come in?
That was crucial for Zabarella. While he recognized the role of the agent intellect in making understanding possible, he really redefined the possible intellect. He didn't see it as just passively receiving knowledge. Instead, he called it patibulus, capable of being acted upon, yes, but also inherently active.
So we're not just empty vessels waiting to be filled with knowledge.
Not at all. This active human intellect, according to him, it can choose what to focus on, what concepts to abstract from sensory experience, and through judgment, ultimately arrive at knowledge. So for Zabarella, thinking wasn't just this automatic reception of information.
It was about active engagement. We choose what to think about.
Exactly. He even linked truth and error in our thinking to
Yeah.
whether or not we use the right methods with these intellectual faculties.
So choosing the right tools for the job, essentially.
Precisely.
Now, Zabarella had some pretty specific ideas about what made natural philosophy as a whole perfect. It
Yeah.
wasn't just about having all the facts about the natural world, right?
That's right. His view was much more nuanced. He argued that the goal of natural philosophy was to deeply understand the essence of natural beings.
Okay, so not just what they are, but why they are.
Exactly. He thought you start with the most basic principles, like matter and motion, which are covered in Aristotle's physics. And then you go on to understand their properties and characteristics through their causes, as detailed in Aristotle's other works on nature.
And you mentioned earlier that he didn't see Aristotle as being absolutely perfect.
That's right. He even pointed out that Aristotle's writings on nature weren't necessarily a complete encyclopedia. For example, there's no specific treatise on minerals. He held Aristotle in incredibly high regard, but he didn't see him as infallible.
So there was still room for new discoveries, new knowledge.
Right. And for Zabarella, the pursuit of new science wasn't about overthrowing everything Aristotle said. He thought Aristotle's philosophy of nature was fundamentally perfect in its structure and form, like how Euclid's Elements was a perfect foundation for geometry.
Okay, so a solid framework that you can build on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he saw new discoveries as refining, correcting small errors, and filling in gaps within that already robust Aristotelian system. He really emphasized that true scientific knowledge, when you achieve it properly, it should always be clear, distinct, and based on sound reasoning.
So new discoveries should fit within that existing framework.
Yes, building upon it, refining it. And this is where his ideas on methodology, like the regressus method, become so important because they provide the tools for making those new discoveries and integrating them into that existing knowledge.
Okay, finally, let's talk about Zabarella's view on the relationship between natural philosophy and medicine. It seems like they're closely related, both dealing with nature, but he made a pretty sharp distinction between them.
He did. Unlike many people back then who saw medicine as either part of or subordinate to natural philosophy, Zabarella saw it differently. He argued that medicine, as both an art and a practice, was fundamentally operational. Its main goal was to achieve a specific result, which is health.
So it's very practical.
Very much so. It's not focused on knowledge for its own sake, but on actually restoring and maintaining health. And because of this focus on a practical outcome, he didn't think medicine could be considered a true science in the same way that natural philosophy or mathematics were.
So even though it deals with the natural world, it has a different goal and therefore a different status.
Exactly. And for Zabarella, understanding the human body just for the sake of knowledge, that was natural philosophy, not medicine.
Makes sense. So it's like the difference between studying anatomy to understand how the body works in general and studying it to figure out how to treat a specific disease.
That's a good way to put it. He drew this clear distinction between the kind of knowledge a doctor gets through observation and dissection and the kind of understanding that natural philosophy seeks through investigating the causes and principles of the body within the broader context of nature.
Okay, so the doctor is focused on the particular, the philosopher on the universal.
Exactly. He even interpreted Aristotle's works in this light. He said that works like the history of animals, which focuses on observation, were different from works like the parts of animals, which looks at causes. He thought medical writers should strive for that kind of causal understanding.
So go beyond just describing what they see to explain why things are the way they are.
Right. And he also pointed out that medicine and natural philosophy have different subject matter. Medicine focuses specifically on the human body and its health, while natural philosophy encompasses all of nature.
Okay, so medicine is a subset of natural philosophy, focusing on one particular part of the natural world.
You could put it that way. And they have a different methods, too. Medicine often uses a resolutive approach, working back from the desired outcome, a cure, to figure out the principles and remedies. But natural philosophy usually uses a compositive approach, moving from general principles to specific phenomena.
Okay, so different ways of approaching their subject matter. And he even argued that physiology, when you study it apart from its practical application in medicine, it actually belongs to natural philosophy, not medicine.
That's right. He thought that studying the functions of the body, the how and why, that was the philosopher's domain.
So the philosopher figures out how the body works in principle, and then the doctor uses that knowledge to figure out what to do when it breaks down.
Exactly. It's like Zabarella said, where the philosopher ends, there the physician begins. The philosopher provides that foundational understanding of the body within nature, and the doctor uses that, along with their own experience, to diagnose and treat specific problems.
That's a really neat way of putting it. So looking back at Zabarella's work, he was clearly a very influential figure, and his influence went way beyond his own lifetime.
He really was. There's been this idea of him being like a direct precursor to the scientific revolution, which has been, challenged a bit by more recent scholarship. But his influence on 17th century thinkers, people who were really investigating nature in new ways, it's undeniable.
So he wasn't necessarily starting the revolution, but he was definitely part of the change that was happening.
Absolutely. His ideas had a huge impact on Protestant Aristotelians in Germany and the Low Countries. His works became standard textbooks all across Europe, and even his instrumentalist view of logic, it found its way into theological debates.
So he was shaping how people thought about lots of different things, not just natural philosophy.
Exactly. He was influential in the British Isles, too. And some scholars even see connections between his work and later thinkers like Kant and Leibniz.
Wow, so his ideas have a really long reach.
Yeah. And even today, people who are studying Aristotle, they still find his commentaries incredibly helpful.
So, to sum up our deep dive, Zabarella offered this really systematic and detailed approach to understanding Aristotle's thought. He made big contributions to our understanding of logic, scientific methodology, particularly with his regressus method, and he had this really nuanced view of how all these different fields of knowledge fit together.
Yeah, his work is impressive. And his emphasis on clear distinctions, rigorous methods, and really understanding the underlying causes of things, it's still really relevant today, I think.
Yeah, it makes you think about how we approach knowledge in our own time, doesn't it?
It does. Like, we're bombarded with information all the time. But do we really understand the why behind things?
That's a great question, and it's something Zabarella might have asked himself too. So here's a final thought for everyone listening. Thinking about Zabarella's distinction between contemplative science and the productive arts, how would we categorize all the different kinds of knowledge and expertise we have in our world today? Does that emphasis on understanding the fundamental why behind things, does it still hold up in a world that's so focused on data and practical applications? It's something to ponder. As always, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we encourage you to keep exploring the world of Renaissance philosophy. Keep those questions about science and knowledge alive.
Always keep asking questions. That's what it's all about.
Exactly. All right, until next time,